I'm just going to speak a little bit about the research because I think it's important that the people who I researched have some idea of what I researched and what I found. I researched community organizing amongst Sudanese asylum seekers from Darfur in Israel. I first got to know the Sudanese community because I worked at the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants between 2004 and 2010. As you know, the first refugees from Darfur came to Israel during those years. I'm sure many of you also know that when the first group was released from prison, they founded B'nai Darfur. Are there people here from B'nai Darfur? There's one. Okay. At the time, B'nai Darfur used the Hotline's offices, and therefore I worked with some of the founders of B'nai Darfur. I continued to be involved in the Sudanese community until about 2012. I did a bit of work with the Darfur Friends Association, and also in 2012, I worked with B'nai Darfur as an employee. This was during the time when B'nai Darfur had a shelter for the second time on Neve Sha'anan. Maybe some of you stayed there. I saw one person tonight already who I know stayed there. As I'm sure you can imagine, as a total outsider, there were a lot of things about the Sudanese community that I didn't understand. For example, I, like many others, didn't really understand the big conflict that took place at the B'nai Darfur General Assembly meeting in 2008. I also knew there was a lot of conflict regarding who got the first A5 visas in 2008. Also, I couldn't figure out how any of the organizations were managed or how you made decisions as a group. The research was my effort to try to understand some of the things that happened during the period when I was active in the Sudanese community organizations. I also chose this topic because I wanted an excuse to spend time with people from the Sudanese community again. On a more academic level, I wanted to research groups or collectives and conflict. As you know, when the colonialists created countries in Africa, they made borders that didn't correspond to ethnic groups. I was in East Africa in 2012 and learned a lot about conflicts that were related to this. For example, in Kenya during elections, there was a lot of violence between different ethnic groups. I was also in Rwanda and learned about the genocide there, which seemed to be conflict between the Hutu and the Tutsi groups. Then I thought about the situation in Israel, and like many of you, I asked myself, why does each group need its own community center? Why can't all of the different ethnicities work together as one organization? I figured there must be conflict between the ethnicities in Israel and Darfur. In my mind, similar to the colonialists and other white people like me, I thought that ethnicity was a bad thing because it creates conflict, and also that ethnicity must be very rigid and inflexible. The two issues outlined here, the role of ethnicity and trying to understand what was really happening in the Sudanese community, were the main foci of my research. In terms of ethnicity and conflict, I want to know how the organizations you establish help you to manage in the difficult Israeli reality. I asked, what kinds of collectives exist among Sudanese in Israel? What do each of them do? Why are they important to some people? Why do other people avoid those groups, such as community centers? When do groups work together, and what do they do that is separate? How do the activities of these groups change over time, and how is that related to your overall situation? How do groups bring people together, but sometimes also divide people? I know I asked many of you questions like this. Idris didn't come, did he? I haven't seen Idris yet. I asked Idris Kornai this last question so many times. He said to me, I see we're back at this again. Understanding unity and division in the community was my main challenge as a researcher. I also wanted to learn how you see each other and understand each other. I know that most Israelis see you as a large, threatening group of infiltrators. Unless they know you really well, they don't really see you as individuals. Others maybe see you as victims of Israeli policy or as victims of the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed. This gives people the impression that you are weak and passive. I know that you don't see yourselves that way. Rather, you see yourselves as people who are active in the world and who take steps to improve your situation despite your limited opportunities and multiple challenges. Sometimes you see each other as representatives of groups, but mostly you see each other as individuals. Amongst you, some are more educated than others, some care more about politics than others, some are more active in community organizations. Some have special talents like writing books, singing, playing guitar, fixing computers. I don't know what happened to Wally. There he is. In the writing that I did about the community, I wanted to portray you as you see yourselves, not as we see you. Therefore, I tried to write about you as a diverse group of individuals which have various strengths and weaknesses, interests and outlooks, in short, as human. Finally, in order to understand how you act and organize as a community, I had to think about the forces that shape your lives. Firstly, I needed to understand how life in Israel and Israeli policy and practice influences you. Secondly, and most importantly, I had to learn a lot about Sudan. I read about Sudanese history and specifically about Darfur. I also read about the different ways people in Sudan organize, such as the difference between associations and organizations, and mostly about your experiences as Africans from Darfur in the Sudanese state. While my research focused on your community organizations, I also learned a lot about how you help each other informally. For example, we talked a lot about how friends and others in your city help you, how you share information on WhatsApp, how people from the same village communicate with each other, and other ways in which you help each other outside of formal organizations. I collected the information that I used as a basis for the research in a few ways. Firstly, I kept a journal or a diary where I wrote down my thoughts, questions, impressions, and things that I learned. I also attended 21 events. This included regime change events, classes at community organizations, events held by the Four Center, and also gatherings in private apartments. I also came to Tel Aviv to visit people every week or two for about 6 months. Finally, I interviewed 52 people. Many of you were probably interviewed by me. Following collection of all that information, I wrote about my findings. I brought to this party a copy of what Ismail Ishaq, who I think didn't make it from Jerusalem, calls my book. In my book, I wrote about 3 different types of organizations in the Sudanese community: NGOs, community centers, and armed political movements. NGOs include B'nai Darfur, Darfur Friends Association, Youngsters Green, and some others, but mostly I wrote about B'nai Darfur. I also wrote about community centers, mainly the Four Center, and also a bit about the Tama and Masalit centers. And finally, I wrote about the SLA and GEM, and also about all of the events you planned during Tasco Bus during regime change in Khartoum. I learned a lot of things through this research. I will discuss some of them now. As noted above, when I began the PhD in 2005, I thought that there was a lot of conflict between the different ethnic groups, and therefore there must be a lot of conflict between the community centers. But when I started talking to you, I began to understand that what I thought was conflict between ethnicities and community centers wasn't really conflict. Instead, I learned that there's a lot of conflict over leadership and politics. Similarly, before I started the research, I thought that ethnic identity was very inflexible and that there are rigid categories between groups. This is similar to how the colonialists thought about Africa. That is why they sometimes created tribes, or in the case of Darfur, Dars. But I learned that this isn't how you see the world. Rather, for you, everything is flexible. In your world, social structures are constantly changing, moving, and flowing in different ways. I think that this ability to adapt and change helps you to survive. I also think that this is a better way of acting in the world, and I wish that my worldview was a bit more like yours. I learned that NGOs emphasize a future in Israel, and for some, a Darfurian identity. Community centers mostly emphasize managing to survive in the present difficult situation in Israel and ethnic identity. And finally, that political organizations emphasize a Sudanese identity and a future in Sudan. All of these organizations offer opportunities for connection, belonging, and contribution to the larger community. They give the present meaning and give you hope for the future. I learned that the organizations that have lasted the longest in Israel and seem to be the most stable and which have the most members don't cooperate with the Israeli government or Israelis in general. Instead, they operate in ways that are familiar to you from Sudan, such as the village, associations, or armed political movements. This is unusual in comparison to refugee organizations in other places. In those places, there can be a lot of conflict within and between organizations, and also problems with management and lack of stability. I also learned a lot about how you understand politics, and specifically Sudanese politics. For example, when you discuss politics, you are always referring to the central government in Sudan. You would never talk about village politics. I also learned that it is an insult to be called a politician. I can't tell you how many times I heard, "I'm not a politician, but." I know that you hate the Sudanese government because they are dividing you and killing you. This helped me to understand why you hate politics so much and why it creates a lot of conflict. Similarly, I learned that you feel that your problems in Sudan are because there is no unity between all of the different ethnic groups, and that you need to be unified to build a new Sudan. I also learned that for you, unity and equality are the same thing. If you were unified, everyone would be equal, and if everyone was equal, then there would be unity between you. I learned that you don't discuss politics in the community centers. The community centers are focused on unconditionally accepting all people from that ethnic group. If you discuss politics, there would be too much conflict and you couldn't effectively help each other. In Israel, unlike in other refugee situations, you are completely on your own. You don't get help or interference from the Israeli government or international agencies, and you also don't have the Sudanese embassy here to interact with you. In this situation, it seems that you're quite effective at figuring out how to help members of your community without us. I think that needing to manage on your own makes your community life more rich and creative and has made your organizations more active and stable than in other places. While Israel or international organizations aren't helping you at all, as you know, you have freedom to organize in Israel however you want. That means that unlike in Sudan, you can express your ethnic identities and political views freely. Because you don't belong in Israel and you believe that you don't have a future in Israel, I learned that you look to your own communities for belonging. Your communities, and particularly your ethnic identities, give you a feeling of being part of something larger than yourselves, which is unique and has its own history. For some people, this is a source of personal pride, freedom, and strength, and helps you to understand how to better manage in the world. I learned that when someone dies, you forget about all of the things you didn't like about that person. Instead, you come together to support the people in mourning and to mourn the person who died. I learned that what happens in Sudan is reflected back onto your organizing in Israel. For example, whenever there is violence in Darfur, you talk about it here. When there is unity during regime change, all of the political movements unified in Israel. Now that Sudan has a government that includes many different ethnic groups and even some of the armed political movements, here you have founded Beit Sudani, which also seeks to bring everyone together in Israel. I learned a lot about ethnicity. I learned that it is flexible and changes over time. For example, When the community centers first opened, they focused more on providing humanitarian assistance, but later on they helped with other things such as education and learning native languages. I also learned that the ethnic group is essential for survival and security. Just like in the village in Sudan, in Israel, you can't depend on the government for help. You can only depend on yourselves. While sometimes ethnic identity causes conflict, it also helps people to survive in hostile situations. Therefore, ethnicity isn't good or bad, it is both. It depends on how it is used. Finally, I now understand that conflicts that look like ethnic conflicts are actually usually conflicts over resources such as money or influence. A leader will then use ethnicity to try to achieve political, social, economic, or cultural goals. I hope that together we have other opportunities to share our learning. If people have questions or comments about anything that I said, you're welcome to come and